everyone. It's great to have you all here today. We all just met before this, so I guess we'll dive right in. I mean, we're here to talk about tokenization. So the first thing that I kind of wanted to ask each of you is, we have several of you are, at larger companies, bigger enterprises that are implementing tokenization on private blockchains. And I'd love to hear if each of you wouldn't mind taking just a moment to introduce yourself and explain how your company or your business is using tokenization. So maybe, John, if you don't mind going last, because I know you're at Coinbase and advising Coinbase, I think that would be, let's start this way.
Yorke Rhodes from Microsoft. I co-founded our blockchain work in 2015. Sort of been through the whole journey of coming from Web3 blockchain, public blockchain, going down the enterprise route of blockchain, which is frankly the only way that you can get large institutions who are risk averse to understand the technology. So I look at that as sort of part of the development journey. And then have put into production some work in supply chain, which is driving essentially real-time reconciliation. And I wouldn't necessarily call it tokenization, but we are essentially identifying assets down to the serialized goods level, which effectively is tokenization, though it's not what you would consider that in a public blockchain sense. And the value proposition there, similar to the quote that was on the screen earlier today, just to do multi-party orchestration, there is a massive amount of reconciliation that happens across companies. And when you can actually get that down to a transaction by transaction, essentially 0-day reconciliation with bank settlement times as when you need to make those transactions, and do that thousands of times a month, that's a very, very significant value proposition for multiple reasons. So that's sort of the work that we're doing in, in the production side of the supply chain work.
Thank you. I'm Puneet Singhvi. I lead digital assets for Citi's institutional client group. So our institutional client group comprises of our trade and treasury services, essentially payments and trade finance business, security services business, the markets business, as well as capital market advisory business. We set up this group early last year, really focused on digital assets and spans across the business lines. As part of that, we also set up a DLT Center of Excellence, very focused on technology implementation and aspects associated with assessment of technologies in this space, which has been incredibly useful and helpful in the entire process and our journey. From a Citi perspective, we have initiatives which are spanning across our product and business lines, typically using permission blockchains, really driven towards kind of 3 or 4 core components. One is driving operational efficiency, as Yorke said, taking out reconciliations, making sure data flow is much more efficient between counterparties or between Citi's different branches and so on and so forth. Second whole component is around capital and collateral. As you think of supply chain in traditional sense, but in the financial services, supply chain has one big component of collateral. And collateral movement and mobility is very essential. And currently, that's not really the case because collateral gets trapped at different points. And from our point of view, looking at that entire space and seeing how we can drive efficiency in collateral in terms of how bank uses capital, how do we really drive efficiency there has been very critical as well. The other piece is around tokenization of money. Has been a pretty big theme. We announced work with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and a number of other institutions around an initiative called Regulated Liability Network as one of the efforts in that area, and more work underway simultaneously on that. But looking at seeing how we can bring programmable money, but within the right regulatory construct, and also take out the silos between institutions to create common network. That's been a pretty significant effort as well. So that's progressing too. So across the board, very focused on finding opportunities with clients, opportunities with our internal processes and counterparties to drive this.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Prakash Neelakantan from Broadridge. Broadridge is actually a traditional fintech focused on securities processing services actually for many banks and brokers, as well as investor communication and governance. And that's our core business. I am responsible for our digital asset strategy actually, and over the last 5 years helped many of our initiatives move using blockchains and distributed ledgers. Broadridge's history in the space has been around for some, like Yorke, not as old as Yorke, but maybe a year later, maybe 2016 onwards. We were one of the earliest adopters of enterprise blockchain
Was that an age reference?
enterprise blockchain technologies. We were early adopters and experimenters in that space. But our goal was to figure out actually specific use cases where it would be deliver real value. And one of the use cases we ended up landing up actually was actually the repo markets. We support many of the primary market dealers in their fixed income processing. And we felt that actually it would be easy to kind of, we knew the problems that they face. Some of them which Puneet just now mentioned, actually collateral, efficient use of collateral, et cetera. So we chose US Treasury repos actually market as a space where we would apply a permissioned private blockchain. Where the value that it brings in is a few things. One is obviously efficiency and automation, right? The second is actually you needed a transparency and a shared golden copy of a contract. A repo is a financial contract, and every party, if you do a bilateral contract, party has got their own version of it. Now we kind of actually have it version in a standardized form shared between multiple parties involved in that, both the parties involved in it, and including their custodians and anybody intermediaries involved in that process. So that's the second part. Automation brings in the efficiency. It involves multiple parties, so you can automate actually the multiple party workflows using smart contracts. So we leverage that. It brings in efficient collateral movement, like Puneet mentioned. Now, if when you say tokenization, you can say it's a digital representation of existing collateral or assets at a custodian. We immobilize that and represent it on the ledger. And then your smart contracts, your financial contracts essentially can operate directly on them actually and move them and transfer them as the life cycle needs of the repo contract needs. We do not link up to the movement of cash. We still go to traditional payment rails. But hopefully as CBDCs, deposit coins, RLN networks, et cetera, come in, we will interface with that actually and move the efficient movement of money to actually in this process. We started with kind of overnight repos, but because tokenization brings in the value of velocity, right? You can move collateral more efficiently. Now we are kind of launching intraday repos so that you can actually have more liquidity, which is what banks want.
Thanks so much, Prakash. John, I want to save you for last because I know Coinbase is, crypto native company, and so maybe you'd have a little bit different perspective on what you've been seeing on the client side and interest from institutions.
I mean, well, so my name is John D'Agostino. I'm head of strategy and partnerships for Coinbase Institutional, and my background is on the exchange side, not the technology side. I was head of strategy for the New York Mercantile Exchange, which at the time was the largest commodities exchange in the world. I mean, I love what I'm hearing because from an institutional perspective, like we want to be the center of gravity for a world with another billion users of crypto. I'm in the institutional silo, so hearing companies like this solve real problems, I think what Prakash was talking about is actually extraordinary. Because for tokenization to be truly effective, you have to find markets that have certain characteristics that create friction that can solve problems. Whereas I do think eventually my daughter's daughter will live in a world where everything will trade via token because it's just a better, more seamless technology. It's going to take more time for things that are working, like crude oil and shares of IBM. I mean, it works pretty well. So I'm not saying we won't get there eventually, but solving the problems that Prakash is speaking at is really encouraging. So yeah, I mean, look, Coinbase, we want to be that center of gravity, whether it's running the marketplace. We obviously have Base, which has been enormously successful at launch. We want people to build businesses. We want people to solve problems, not just with that protocol, with other protocols. And they can be problems as as mundane as how to finance art, which most people kind of look down on. But I think if we can make the world, if all NFTs ever accomplish and tokenization ever accomplishes is making it easier for artists to finance their work, I think the world's a decidedly better place. But ranging from that to things like identity, and this is all wonderful to hear.
Awesome, thanks. And Prakash, you touched a little bit on this, but everyone sort of was talking about efficiency, and it seems like that's one of the big benefits that enterprises realize when using permission blockchains. I'd love to hear if Puneet or Yorke, you have any other examples of really compelling use cases that you've either seen or been involved with.
Yeah, well, I was actually going to mention gaming, not specifically work that's going on at Microsoft, but if you think about the gaming market, it's traditionally fairly, it's a broad market, right? You have indie games all the way to AAA studios. AAA studios are typically very large businesses, right? And so they are relatively large enterprises in themselves. And while they're on a development cycle of a game in that category is a 4-year development cycle, there is opportunity for disruption there. And I think as consumers typically, sort of lament one thing about games, it's basically their lack of control of their destiny in terms of the things that they've spent time collecting inside of games. And it's an opportunity where you don't necessarily have to be on sort of the nose in terms of saying that, we're going to go do these NFT-based games. But if you have ownable digital assets that are part of the core, that actually changes one of the key factors that consumers really don't like about games, which is that lack of control of their destiny. So I think that's a very interesting category that we will certainly see emerging. It's already happening in some of the smaller game studios.
Yep. So just to add to that, beyond efficiency, just think about distribution and democratization of access. Talked about, but to just point out real examples, we invested in a company in Singapore, which is a regulated market infrastructure called Bond Value. Typically for retail customers to invest in bonds very hard because the face value is very large. So you need to kind of put $100,000 or whatever to invest in a bond. And it's not very easily accessible, just like stock markets are. And here, what Bond Value is really doing is taking bonds and fractionalizing them, and through their front-end platform in an exchange called Bond Blocks, effectively allowing retail customers at a much lower denomination to get access to the bond market. You see something similar in the US with the fund manager community. Franklin Templeton, Wisdom Tree Prime, effectively trying to see if they can launch ability to reach the retail customer directly and much more efficiently. So we're seeing those examples, which are very fascinating because something which the markets always wanted, but was very difficult to attain with the existing technology stack which people had. But now with this implementation, we're kind of seeing that proliferate very quickly. So I definitely want to look out for how the distribution aspects of financial products will work in the future, and could this actually drive next level of efficiency?
So the lowest common denominator use case that has the highest probability of mass usage. And for me, it's any industry that combines value and entertainment and experience. So I'll throw one out. So when I joined NYMEX in 2000, we made 80% of our revenue from trading commissions, 20% from data sales. By the time I left NYMEX, we realized, wow, you can take these data sets and you can sell them in chunks. But then the big innovation was you can time slice them, and you can infinitely sell the same data pool. So the analogy I'm using is, imagine a world where Taylor Swift tokenizes a ticket stub to her concert, and ownership of a tranche of that ticket stub programmatically through a smart contract allows you access to her tweets 10 seconds before everybody else. Imagine if she could time slice her experience of engaging with Taylor Swift the way we time slice data and took it from a nothing business to a massive data sale business. Stuff like that. I think it's extraordinarily exciting and interesting. I may not care, but a lot of people would care. And they would get real value from it.
And interesting to John's point, actually, you can also already do that. I don't know if you're a crypto Twitter follower, but Eric Wall actually has tokenized his time, actually, right? And you can invest in that and participate.
That's wild. I hadn't heard of
Consulting time, actually. So
He tokenized his what?
his time for consulting, yeah. So.
Cool.
So you can block that, actually, so it's on crypto. So people experiment with a lot of these things. So like Puneet mentioned, see, there are 2-3 things that people say tokenization will help in. One is, as we talked about, efficiency, movements, etc. Second was actually fractionalization and ownership, so broader democratic ownership. And obviously liquidity is a third thing that people talk about. But tokenization necessarily does not mean fractionalization or liquidity is a mandatory thing or it'll happen. I think it also, you need to find real use for these assets. Obviously, everything need not be a bearer token, which I'll own, put in my wallet, take the risk of actually preserving the keys, etc. Right? If I can use the asset, whatever is tokenized, and I get access to it and use it for, say, to borrow, right? And if it makes it easily accessible, that's really valuable, right? So we need to find more use cases for where these tokens can be put to use, right? But the other real benefit is servicing. So if I actually have a bond or an asset, etc., you need to do asset servicing. If I have 1 million bondholders, actually, I can automate the whole asset servicing aspect of it, right? Coupon issuances, etc., through this whole life cycle. You get that's a whole new efficiency, right? So I don't have to worry about whether I receive my dividend or coupon, etc., because that's all automated as long as and hopefully it'll be deposited as CBDC or some kind of digital cash, and it'll be immediately released to every bondholder, etc. So those are the kind of efficiencies we think that will happen over the future, right? And the retail obviously will benefit as well as institutions.
In 2018, I worked with the World Bank on a blockchain bond project, and that was exactly that, right? The whole efficiency, taking out the middleman, direct to investor, coupon payments, slice of the pie, and everything. So it was a 2-year bond, highly successful, oversubscribed, very efficient. It was 100% on blockchain, permissioned blockchain, by the way,
Right.
And it worked quite well. Very small ecosystem, which is typically where permissioned blockchains work, where you have a defined set of parties that's not too large. I would say that is like the difference, right? If you have a very large ecosystem, then permissioned blockchains would be very hard, at least as we think about them today. But I think you can also think about...
Is that because of, of governance issues or scalability issues?
It's ecosystem size issues, right? Anytime you're trying to do something in the large, if you only have 20 participants, that's not going to work, right? And so I was going to just add to that if you think about layer 2s or parachains and things like that, those are effectively parts of a public blockchain that have a specific ecosystem, right? And so you could also change that model and thinking about how you might do something in the public that today you would have to do in a permissioned environment.
It's actually good that you brought that up, because my next question and the next thing I wanted to hear from you all about is, what are some of the hurdles? I mean, what are some use cases where it's challenging or it doesn't make sense to use a permissioned blockchain?
Well, that's one example, right?
Yeah.
It's just, size, right? Size of ecosystem, mass adoption. Anytime your audience you're trying to get to is not limited and finite and controllable, then obviously it's not going to work in a permissioned context, unless you're using that permission blockchain in the background for some specific reason, like settlement or something like that. So yeah, that's how I look at the distinction, really.
4 things which come to mind. First is that you need the right ecosystem. Markets are social in nature. There are buyers and sellers, and everybody needs to interact, and liquidity really comes when the whole market comes together. So if you have not really have an ecosystem around the solution, then it's limited in terms of benefits it can accomplish. To that end, I always think kind of keeping blockchain isolation is incorrect, because it should interconnect with the traditional rails. And some of the work we'll probably announce is linked to that. So we do not want people to be kind of limited to one set of ecosystem, but be able to transact across. The second component is technology maturity. I think still nascent, a lot of pieces to be put in place. A lot of different standards at this point in time. So I think convergence around standards, technology adoption, which makes it easier for people to implement that, is also another critical component. The third piece is kind of right regulatory frameworks. A lot of engagement recently in Europe. You had DLT pilot regime. MiCA. In US now, regulators are much more closely engaged. Same thing happening in Asia. So I think having the right for financial services, actually having the right regulatory framework is extremely critical. So I think those pieces are all going to go hand in hand with it. But what I find very encouraging this year in particular is the level of experimentation with permission blockchains in traditional financial markets has grown rapidly. We see asset managers engage in this. We see broker-dealers engage in this. We see banks engage in this, and not just in the US, globally in Europe, in Asia. BIS, which is the global body for central banks, engaging deeply into figuring out multi-CBDC arrangements. So a lot of different pieces of work which is going together. We hope all of this finally connects and drives this ecosystem which is consistent with common standards for reaping real benefits. Till then, really benefits won't accrue.
I think you were asking about limitations of permissioned blockchains.
Yeah.
I think Yorke mentioned one actually. If you want global distribution, right, which is limitless, I think you need a public blockchain, because that's the only way anybody anywhere can access. Many assets like that, say Bitcoin, Ether, etc., are actually globally accessible, right? So that's the benefit, right? So if you want distribution globally, but the problem is actually that you also need a regulated infrastructure to protect these investors around these public blockchains. And that's evolving, like Puneet mentioned, I think. And as that grows and becomes better, I think for mass retail adoption, I think it's a great use case. Permission blockchains, by definition itself, are for limited audiences, for specific use cases, applications, etc. Right? It can also scale, but the question is not for scale and volume of transactions, not for number of participants. Right? So I think that's the main benefit. I would say the only other kind of permissionless, I think DeFi, the original goal was actually that you will build a compositional ecosystem of financial primitives, that you can build more and more services. That kind of model in the permissioned world is much more difficult to build. It's much more easy to build actually in a permissionless world. We'll have to see the evolution of DeFi and how it grows, but I think that's the direction where public blockchains can really kind of succeed.
When you're using these sorts of technologies, how do you avoid some of the pitfalls that we've seen in other parts of the blockchain and crypto world in terms of disclosure and transparency? I mean, is that an issue that comes up when using private blockchains versus public?
Disclosure is, I think, more with respect to actually the participants, right? So if I'm a coin issuer, right, today they'll write up a white paper, put it on their website, and then they will list themselves in a crypto exchange and centralized exchange, or in actually they'll find actually a pair to trade actually on a DeFi DEX actually, right? Now, who's responsible for disclosure? As long as the problem is actually most of these products and white papers are not written for an average retail investor to even digest. They kind of define a protocol, a lot of technical details. I think you need a new regime. We recently did a survey of actually 2,000 retail investors across 3 countries to figure out what kind of information they'll be interested in. Many of them are not even educated in what kind of, they were not interested in token economics. But if you're a token holder, the token economics has an impact on the value that you hold, right? They were looking for traditional financial metrics, which most tokens don't publish, right? So you don't get a 10K filing, etc. So I think you need a new form of disclosure, which is more amenable actually to these kind of assets. And hopefully that will drive actually better usage of these products.
I think, in any shared ledger technology, whether it's public or private, you're still dealing with the preconceived notion of proprietary data, right, and particularly from an enterprise perspective. And so figuring out how to put in the right guardrails and then getting the participants to agree that those are safe guardrails is probably the biggest challenge in terms of that. And that's actually not going to be any different whether you do it in public or private. It's just that the technical approaches might have different technical approaches. And it takes a while. Like whenever you're trying to get companies to participate in a shared ledger environment, which brings you to the shared source of truth, which actually allows you to realize the efficiency gains, that's sort of the magic, and it takes a bit of time to basically convince people that the technical approach satisfies them from the perspective of, yes, it is secure, and we're happy with that. And so that's, in an enterprise context, that's one of the reasons why this journey takes so long in general. And I would say, second thing and this is not necessarily an answer to that question, but I think is really important to consider is any enterprise outside of the financial markets has a very conservative treasury where they are not used to having assets on their books that fluctuate in value dramatically. And so that's an impediment to directly holding tokens under a large enterprise. And that's something that we have to figure out of how to do that effectively. And I think that would unlock a lot of enterprises' participation in a public market like that.
I mean, not to be cynical, but disclosures don't really protect investors. They de-risk litigation and satisfy regulators. So my short answer is to solve that problem, throw a lot of lawyers at it and throw some very good lawyers at it. And if the demand is there, that'll solve itself.
Fair enough. I want to end with one quick question, if just one of you wants to weigh in on this. We've seen other shifts in capital markets technology before, the shift to electronic trading, for example. Just wondering if there are any lessons to be learned from that shift when it comes to tokenization and how it's going to play out.
A lot of similarities from that, and it took a long time from open outcry to fully digital markets. I mean, we're sitting in Yorke Exchange, that's an example. So a lot of similarities. It required regulations to be put in place, people to actually reskill themselves, to approach the whole approach differently. Banks had to, and institutions had to restack. Suddenly you had a number of new players come in which were not possible before. So I do see a lot of similarities from that and a lot of learnings which to be had, because every major shift in financial markets has happened in a particular format. Ecosystem development, technology, regulations, all of these pieces coming together, I think is very similar here.
If you indulge me just real quick, I know we're out of time. I love this question because I got my start on the floor, open outcry, with 868 guys screaming at me because my first job was to build in C# a handheld trading app to displace the pick cards back in 2002. And I got punched in the back of the head and knocked unconscious on the floor of the NYMEX because I portended the end of that world. And I'll say one lesson I learned from that experience is not everyone who resists change is an idiot or a Luddite. And I think part of the problem we have in crypto is we tend to look down on people who don't want to displace really important systems with new ideas. And even if that idea is better, I mean, even in 2002, clearly open outcry was insane. But as one old grizzled trader, I'll never forget, he kind of grabbed me and he said, you know, kid, there's a reason the design of the spoon hasn't changed since the day of the caveman. It works.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
And I was like, oh, you're right. Like, that's a really good point. So I just think we have to be sympathetic. These are crucially important economic systems and social systems. I don't want to be the first guy to test the better heart surgery technique on me. Like, I want it to be on everybody else. And just be sympathetic to that view.
Thanks so much, John. I think that's a great place to wrap it up. And thanks all for your time.
Thank you.